The smoke has cleared. The screaming has stopped. And Daria stands in what used to be her courtyard, watching Mongol soldiers sort the survivors into groups she doesn't yet understand. Her husband was taken 3 days ago, dragged from their home with every other man who could hold a weapon. She hasn't seen him since. She doesn't know he's already dead. What she does know is this: the soldiers are pointing at her. They're pointing at all the women of childbearing age. And the look in their eyes isn't murder, it's something worse. Because what the Mongols did to the wives of captured and killed men wasn't a footnote in military history. It was the entire strategy. A systematic transformation of conquest into something that lasted generations. Something that didn't just take territory. It took futures, identities, bloodlines. This is what it actually felt like when an empire didn't stop at the battlefield. You've heard about Genghis Khan's military genius, the mounted archers, the psychological warfare, the messenger systems, and the intelligence networks. The largest land empire in human history, stretching from Korea to Hungary. But here's what that empire actually looked like from the ground. The morning after conquest, when the killing stopped and the sorting began. When women were lined up in public squares and examined like livestock at market. When children were separated from mothers with the same efficiency as cataloging grain shipments. When the real work of empire started, not on horseback with arrows flying, but in the years that followed. Inside homes that were no longer homes, to women who were no longer allowed to be who they used to be. Because the Mongols understood something most conquerors didn't, something that Rome eventually learned, something every lasting empire rediscovers. Killing the men removes one generation, but controlling the women, that reshapes entire civilizations. And if you've never heard history told like this, as if you were standing in that courtyard with Darya, feeling the weight of Mongol eyes on you, understanding in your bones that your entire future just changed in ways you can't yet comprehend, then subscribe to Ancient Africa Untold right now. Because this is how the past actually felt. And there's more. The Mongol Empire operated under a legal code called the Yasa, established by Genghis Khan himself sometime around 1206. The Yasa wasn't just military law, it was a blueprint for remaking societies. A systematic manual for transforming conquered peoples into Mongol subjects, and it covered everything from theft to marriage to how to process captives after battle. After conquest, populations were divided with surgical precision. The process was documented by multiple sources because it happened the same way in every major city that fell. Men of fighting age were identified first. Most were executed immediately. The Mongols couldn't risk leaving armed men alive behind their lines. Some, those with useful skills or those who surrendered without resistance, might be conscripted into Mongol armies and sent to fight on distant frontiers where their deaths would serve Mongol interests. Skilled artisans were the second category. Blacksmiths, engineers, scribes, physicians, anyone with technical knowledge the empire could use. These were enslaved and relocated to wherever the Mongols needed their expertise. A Chinese engineer might find himself building siege equipment in Persia. A Persian physician might end up treating Mongol nobles in Karakoram. Children under 12 formed the third category. Young enough to forget, young enough to reshape. These were taken from their families and distributed to Mongol households to be raised as Mongols. Within a generation, they would speak Mongolian as their first language, honor Mongol ancestors, think of themselves as Mongol. And then there were the women. Women of childbearing age were counted, classified, and distributed to warriors as rewards for service. Persian historian Atamalik Juvaini witnessed the fall of multiple cities during the Mongol conquests of the 1220s through 1250s. He was there. He saw this process firsthand, and he described it with the clinical precision of someone documenting something he'd seen repeated so many times it had become routine. After the slaughter ceased, the remaining women were divided. Each warrior received a portion according to his rank. The women were counted like sheep and distributed accordingly. Not sold. Distributed, as if they were military equipment, as if they were shares of plunder to be divided among the victors. The Yasa made this legal, made it policy, made it systematic, made it repeatable in every city, every province, every conquered kingdom across an empire that would eventually control more territory than any continuous land empire before or since. So why did the Mongols build this into their law? Why make it official policy rather than just something that happened chaotically in the aftermath of battle? Because they had figured out what Rome learned, what the Ottomans would later discover, what every lasting empire eventually realizes. You can take territory in months. The Mongol army could conquer a kingdom faster than most armies could march across it. But people will resist for generations, if they remember who they used to be. The solution? Make them forget. By forcing conquered women to bear Mongol children, the empire achieved something no army alone could accomplish. First, these women could no longer bear the next generation of enemy warriors. Every child they conceived would be half Mongol, raised in Mongol households, loyal to Mongol interests. Second, their children would be raised speaking Mongolian, honoring Mongol ancestors, serving Mongol purposes. The mother might remember her homeland, but the child wouldn't. The grandchild certainly wouldn't. Third, within 2 generations, the conquered culture would dissolve from the inside. Not destroyed, absorbed. The people would still be there, but they wouldn't be the same people anymore. This wasn't cruelty for cruelty's sake. This was demographic engineering, cultural replacement, bloodline absorption. And the scale was staggering. The Mongol Empire at its height controlled territory from the Pacific Ocean to Eastern Europe, from the frozen forests of Siberia to the deserts of Persia. Everywhere they went, this system followed. Millions of women, hundreds of different cultures, dozens of languages, all processed through the same mechanism, and it worked. When Darya was separated from her children, both under 6 years old, a boy and a girl, she didn't scream. The women who screamed were beaten until they stopped. She learned that in the first 10 minutes. After a city fell, women were gathered in public squares. Sometimes it took days just to assemble everyone. The Mongols were methodical. They went house to house, pulling women from cellars and hiding places, checking every room, every storage building, every temple. Mongol officers moved through the crowds with practiced efficiency. This wasn't their first city. For many, it wasn't even their 10th. They checked teeth, looking for health, looking for age. Broken teeth, missing teeth, infected gums. These indicated older women or poor health. They examined hands. Soft hands meant nobility, meant this woman had never worked fields or hauled water. Calloused hands meant labor, meant lower status. They asked questions, though the answers often didn't matter. Age, children, husband's occupation, whether she could read. The sorting followed a pattern that varied slightly by region but remained fundamentally the same. Noble women were identified first. The wives and daughters of the city's ruling class. Their value wasn't labor. It was symbolic. To claim the wife of a defeated lord, to marry her in a Mongol ceremony, to parade her in Mongol dress before her former subjects, this was to demonstrate that conquest was total, complete, that the highest woman of the old order was now property of the new. Young women of childbearing age formed the largest group, ages roughly 15 to 35, though the Mongols cared more about apparent fertility than specific numbers. These would be distributed to soldiers and officers as rewards for service. The more distinguished the warrior, the more women he received. An ordinary soldier might receive one. An officer who'd shown exceptional bravery might receive 5 or 10. Older women were assessed for usefulness. Those with skills, midwifery, weaving, cooking, might be kept as domestic labor. Those without were sometimes released, sometimes kept anyway, sometimes killed if the conquerors decided feeding them wasn't worth the resources. Young children were separated into another group entirely, to be processed according to different protocols. The siege of Nishapur in April 1221 ended with the city's complete destruction. Genghis Khan's son-in-law Tokuchar had been killed during the siege, and the Khan ordered total annihilation in revenge. Contemporary accounts, both Persian and Mongol, describe how after the battle ended and the final resistors were killed, the Mongols spent 3 full days organizing the survivors, 3 days of turning human beings into categories, 3 days of deciding futures with the stroke of a brush on parchment, making marks on wax tablets, pointing and sorting and counting. And then the distributions began. Darya was classified as suitable for assignment. She was 26 years old. She was healthy, her teeth were good, her body showed no signs of disease. Her hands showed she'd never done hard labor, which meant she'd had some status in the old order. She could cook, could manage a household, could probably be trained to serve Mongol needs. She was given to a Mongol officer named Batu. Batu was a minor commander, not nobility but distinguished enough. He'd been among the first to breach the city walls, had personally killed 3 defenders, had shown the kind of aggressive courage the Mongol military rewarded. Darya became his property on the same day her husband's body was burned in a mass pyre outside the city. She didn't know that yet. She wouldn't know for weeks. But it had already happened. The assignment wasn't slavery in the way most people understand the word. It was something stranger. Something that required Darya to participate in her own transformation. Under Mongol law, these women weren't concubines in the traditional sense. They weren't temporary pleasure servants to be discarded when their masters tired of them. They were wives. Secondary wives, yes. Junior wives in a polygamous household. But wives with legal status, with defined roles, with expectations and duties. Batu already had 2 Mongol wives. His first wife, Kulan, had given him 3 sons. His second wife had given him a daughter. Darya would be the 3rd wife, the most junior member of the household's female hierarchy. She was expected to manage part of the household, to cook meals, not Persian meals, but Mongol meals. Boiled mutton, mare's milk, the foods of the steppe. She was expected to maintain clothing, to manage supplies, to keep order in her section of the household. And she was expected to learn Mongolian, not as a courtesy, not as an intellectual exercise, but as a requirement for basic survival. Because Batu spoke no Persian. His Mongol wives spoke no Persian. The other servants in the household spoke no Persian. If Darya couldn't communicate, she couldn't function, couldn't follow instructions, couldn't avoid punishment for misunderstanding orders. Within the first week, she learned 30 words, basic objects, commands, yes and no. Within the first month, she could follow simple conversations. Within 3 months, she was functional. Within a year, she was fluent, and within that same year, she was pregnant. This is where the system revealed its true genius. Darya now faced something that thousands of women in her exact position faced across the empire. An impossible choice. She could resist. She could refuse to learn more than the bare minimum of language. She could refuse to adopt Mongol customs, refuse to let go of who she'd been, refuse to become what they wanted her to be. But resistance didn't hurt Batu. He had other wives, he had servants. He could ignore Darya entirely if he chose, and resistance didn't hurt the Mongol Empire. They had millions of subjects. One defiant woman in one household changed nothing. Resistance hurt the child. Because if Darya remained defiant, if she couldn't communicate fluently, if she couldn't function smoothly in the household, if she remained visibly foreign and resistant, her child would be raised entirely by Batu's Mongol wives. They would feed the infant. They would teach the child to speak. They would train the child in Mongol customs, and Darya would watch her own child become a stranger. But if she complied, if she learned Mongolian fluently enough to teach it, if she cooked Mongol food skillfully enough to feed her child, if she adopted Mongol dress and Mongol customs and taught her child to honor Mongol ancestors, then she became the primary instrument of her own culture's destruction. This wasn't a choice. This was a trap. Every action led to loss. The only question was which loss she could live with. Marco Polo spent 17 years traveling through Mongol territories between 1271 and 1295, decades after the initial conquest, but while the system was still very much in operation. He observed this dynamic in multiple regions and wrote about it with remarkable clarity. The Mongol warriors take as many wives as they can sustain. Many of these are women from conquered peoples. Their children are raised Mongol in all ways, knowing little of their mother's origins beyond what the mothers whisper in private. Little. Not nothing. Little. Meaning the mothers tried. They fought back in the only ways available to them. They whispered stories when no one else was listening. They sang lullabies in forbidden languages when the Mongol wives were in other parts of the household. They taught words their children would never be able to use in public, words that existed only in the space between mother and child. But it wasn't enough. The Mongol world was louder, more present, more necessary for survival, and the system was designed to win regardless of what the mother chose. If she resisted, she lost the child to Mongol wives. If she complied, she lost the child to Mongol culture. Either way, the child became Mongol. Either way, the empire won. If you're starting to feel the walls closing in, if you're beginning to understand how this system trapped everyone inside it with no escape, then you're feeling what Darya felt. This is what conquest actually looked like. Not armies and arrows. That was just the beginning. That was just the part that opened the door. This is what came after. This is what lasted. This is what changed everything. And if you want more history told like this, as if you're living it, as if you can feel the trap closing around you, subscribe to Ancient Africa Untold right now and turn on notifications. Drop a comment telling me, can you feel it? Can you feel that impossible choice? Because it gets worse. Darya's son was born in the spring of 1222. She named him Rashid, a Persian name meaning rightly guided. She whispered it to him in the hours after birth, before anyone else had named him, claiming him with language while she still could. Batu called him Timur, a Mongol name meaning iron. Both names stuck. The household used Timur. Darya used Rashid when they were alone. The boy grew up answering to both. And in that small detail, in those two names existing simultaneously, you can see the entire strategy at work. By the time Temur Rashid was 2 years old, he understood Mongolian better than Persian. The Mongol words came from everyone. The Persian words came only from his mother, and only sometimes. By the time he was 4, he spoke Mongolian fluently and Persian haltingly, with an accent that marked him as someone learning a foreign language rather than speaking his mother tongue. By the time he was 5, he played with the sons of Batu's Mongol wives, learned to ride horses in the Mongol style, learned so young he barely remembered learning, the way children absorb skills when they start early enough, was taught that his father's people were strong, were civilized, were the rightful rulers of the world because heaven itself had granted them dominion over the earth. Darya tried. She told him stories of her homeland when they were alone, described the city she'd come from, the markets, the gardens, the sound of the call to prayer echoing across rooftops at sunset. She taught him prayers in Persian, simple ones at first, then more complex verses as he got older. She sang him lullabies her mother had sung to her, songs about nightingales and roses, songs about heroes from Persian epics, songs that carried the weight of a culture he would never fully know. But every day, the Mongol world got louder. Batu's household held 23 people, 3 wives, 7 children from various mothers, 13 servants and slaves. 22 of them spoke Mongolian as their primary language. 1 spoke Persian. Every day, Timur practiced archery with his half-brothers, and they shouted to each other in Mongolian. Every day, he ate meals prepared in the Mongol style, and the conversations around the cooking fire were in Mongolian. Every day, he learned lessons about Mongol history, Mongol law, Mongol customs, all in Mongolian. And every day, his mother's whispered Persian got quieter in comparison. By the time Timur was 10 years old, he thought of himself as Mongol. Oh, he knew his mother was from somewhere else. That was obvious. Her face was different. Her accent in Mongolian, even after years of fluency, carried traces of something foreign. Sometimes she used Persian words when she forgot herself, but it was abstract, distant, like knowing your grandmother came from a province you'd never visited. Interesting in a vague way, but not really part of who you were. When Timur was 12, Batu began training him seriously as a warrior. This was normal. Mongol boys began martial training early, but 12 was when it intensified, when boys transitioned from playing at war to preparing for it. Timur learned to shoot from horseback at full gallop, learned to coordinate with other riders in formation, learned the signals, the tactics, the discipline that made Mongol cavalry the most feared military force in the known world. When he was 15, he rode in his first campaign. The target was a Persian city, he never learned which one, that had refused to pay tribute to the local Mongol administrator. A small rebellion, a minor problem, the kind of thing that happened periodically as the empire consolidated control over conquered territories. Timur rode with Batu's unit. He killed his first man in the assault, a defender on the walls who fell with Timur's arrow in his throat. He felt proud, felt like he'd proven himself, felt like he'd become a warrior in the tradition of his father and his fathers before him. Daria never asked if any of her relatives had been in that city. She knew better than to ask questions like that anymore. Knew better than to think too hard about what her son had become, because the alternative, dwelling on it, mourning it, resisting it, would only drive him further away. And she couldn't bear losing him more than she already had. This scene repeated across the empire. Different names, different cities, different mothers, but the same pattern. Ibn Battuta, the Moroccan scholar who traveled through Mongol territories in the 1330s, a full century after the initial conquests, described entire communities of what he called mixed peoples. He wrote, "In many regions you find people whose faces bear features of the Persians, or the Chinese, or the Rus peoples, but they speak only Mongolian. They know nothing of their mothers' origins except that their mothers came from elsewhere. They are Mongol in law, in custom, in loyalty. They fight for Mongol Khans and consider themselves true subjects of the empire." A century later, and the children didn't even know there was something to remember. The grandchildren of women like Darya grew up thinking their grandmothers had always been Mongol wives, just wives who looked a little different, just wives from the provinces. Not women who'd had entire lives before, not women from cities that no longer existed, not women who'd lost everything in a single day and then been forced to live for decades inside that loss. The system had worked exactly as designed, not through force alone, though force had been necessary at the beginning, but through time, through children, through the slow, inevitable process of forgetting that happens when one generation can't or won't pass on their memories to the next. Through mothers who chose to let their children survive rather than burdening them with a heritage that would only bring them pain. Some mothers couldn't do it, couldn't watch their children become strangers, couldn't let the language die, couldn't stop teaching, remembering, resisting, even when they knew it was futile, even when they knew it would cost them everything. The Mongol system had a solution for this too. It wasn't execution. Execution would have been mercy. Execution would have ended the suffering and potentially created sympathy. It was separation. Atta Malik Juvayni's chronicle, written in the 1250s while he served the Mongol Ilkhanate in Persia, contains a brief account that's easy to miss if you're not looking for it. Just a few lines in a longer section about provincial administration. A noblewoman from Herat, her name isn't recorded, just her crime. She had been teaching her 9-year-old daughter Persian poetry, classical verses from Ferdowsi's Shahnameh, the old literature, the cultural heritage that was supposed to be forgotten. Someone reported her. The chronicle doesn't say who, probably another woman in the household, possibly one of the Mongol wives, possibly another captive woman trying to prove her loyalty. The Mongol administrator in charge of that province didn't beat the woman, didn't threaten her, didn't torture her into compliance. He simply had the daughter taken. The girl was sent to a Mongol general's household 800 kilometers away. She would be raised there. She would forget her mother's language, forget her mother's poetry, forget everything except what her new household taught her. She would become useful. The mother lived another 18 years. She never saw her daughter again. Never knew if she survived childhood. Child mortality was high, and the journey alone was dangerous. Never knew if she married, if she had children, if she ever thought about her mother. Never knew if she remembered the poetry, or if it faded like everything else. Just lived with the knowledge that her resistance had accomplished nothing except losing the only thing she had left. According to the chronicle, the woman's Mongol husband took another wife within 6 months. The mother had proven herself difficult, unreliable, not worth the trouble. She was kept alive. Killing her would have been wasteful, but marginalized. Given the worst tasks, the least food, the smallest space. She died in 1264. The chronicle records her death only because it affected property distribution in the household. Her name is not recorded. This is how the system enforced compliance. Not through violence against the women, though violence was always available when needed, but through threatening the children, because a mother could endure almost anything done to her own body, could endure beatings, deprivation, humiliation, forced labor. But watching her child suffer for her defiance, watching her child taken away forever, sent to strangers hundreds of kilometers away, raised to forget her, that was unbearable. So most chose silence. Most chose to participate in the erasure. Most taught their children Mongol songs and swallowed their own. Most whispered Persian lullabies but taught Mongolian prayers. Most let their cultures die quietly rather than loudly and lose their children in the process, because the alternative was losing them entirely, and immediately, and knowing you caused it. The Mongols had built a system where love itself became the enforcement mechanism, where the natural instinct to protect your child was turned into a weapon against cultural survival, where every mother faced the same impossible choice, and almost every mother made the same decision, because what else could they do? This wasn't rare. This wasn't isolated to a few cities or a few years. This was policy across an empire that, at its height, stretched from the Pacific Ocean to Eastern Europe. Consider the scale. Between 1206 and 1368, the Mongol Empire conquered territory containing an estimated 100 million people. That's roughly 20% of the entire global population at the time. Not all of those territories involved this level of population transfer. Some regions submitted peacefully and maintained more autonomy. Some regions were depopulated through massacre rather than absorption. But many regions, the richest, most densely populated regions, were processed exactly this way. When the Mongols conquered northern China from the Jin dynasty in the campaigns of the 1230s and 1240s, Chinese sources describe mass distributions of captive women. The chronicles use euphemistic language bestowed upon worthy warriors, but the meaning is clear. When they conquered Persia in the 1220s, Persian chronicles document the same process. Juvayni, Rashid al-Din, and other historians working under Mongol patronage couldn't avoid mentioning it entirely, though they softened the language. when they invaded Russ's territories in the 1230s and 1240s. Slavic chronicles describe identical patterns. Women taken, children scattered, populations reorganized under Mongol administration. Every major conquest followed the same blueprint. Modern genetic studies have revealed the biological evidence of what the chronicles describe. In 2003, a team of geneticists published a study in the American Journal of Human Genetics that examined Y chromosome patterns across Asia. They found that approximately 8% of men in territories once controlled by the Mongol Empire carry Y chromosome markers that trace back to a common ancestor who lived approximately 800 of 1,000 years ago, exactly the period of Mongol expansion. That's roughly 16 million men alive today who share descent from Mongol conquerors through the male line. That's not from natural population growth. That's not from voluntary intermarriage. That's from systematic forced reproduction. And those are just the lineages traced through the male line, which genetic testing can track relatively easily. The maternal lineages, the women's stories, are harder to trace genetically because mitochondrial DNA doesn't carry the same distinctive markers. But we know they existed. We know because languages disappeared. Entire languages that were spoken by hundreds of thousands of people in the 13th century don't exist anymore. Not because everyone who spoke them died, but because their children learned different languages and never passed on the old ones. We know because cultural practices vanished. Religious traditions that had lasted centuries dissolved within a few generations of Mongol conquest. Not because they were banned, the Mongols were generally tolerant of different religions, but because parents stopped teaching them to children. We know because entire ethnic groups that existed before Mongol conquest had dissolved by the time the empire fragmented. Not through genocide, but through assimilation, through children who were half Mongol, and grandchildren who were three-quarters, and great-grandchildren who thought of themselves as Mongol entirely. The genetic evidence, the linguistic evidence, the cultural evidence, the contemporary chronicles in Persian, Chinese, and Mongolian. They all point to the same conclusion. This happened on a massive scale, and it worked. If this happened on such a massive scale, why aren't there more sources? Why don't we have thousands of women's accounts? Why do we have to reconstruct this from fragments and genetic evidence and brief mentions in chronicles? The answer tells you everything about how power works, about who gets to write history, about whose stories survive and whose disappear. First, most of these women were illiterate. Literacy rates for women in 13th century Persia, China, or Rus territories were extremely low. Estimates range from 2% to 5% at best. These were women from cities, from kingdoms, from civilizations that had schools and books and written traditions. But those schools and books were almost entirely reserved for men. The women couldn't write their own stories. Second, even literate women had no safe way to record what was happening. Writing criticism of Mongol policy was treason. Could get you killed, could get your family killed. Keeping written records of resistance was evidence that could be used against you. The few literate women who existed in these households had to be extraordinarily careful about what they committed to paper. Third, their children couldn't tell these stories because their children had been specifically raised not to know them. By the second generation, there was nothing to tell. The grandmother might have memories, might have fragments of the old language and the old culture, but she'd never taught them to her children because teaching them was too dangerous. So the grandchildren knew nothing. Fourth, the Mongol Empire eventually fragmented into successor states. The Yuan dynasty in China, ruled by Kublai Khan's descendants. The Ilkhanate in Persia, ruled by Hulagu Khan's descendants. The Golden Horde in Russia, ruled by Jochi's descendants. The Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia. These successor states needed legitimacy. They needed to justify their rule over populations that vastly outnumbered the Mongol elite. They needed to portray Mongol conquest as civilizing, as bringing order and prosperity, as fulfilling a divine mandate. They couldn't do that while acknowledging that the empire was built on mass sexual violence and forced cultural assimilation. So, the records that were kept, the official chronicles commissioned by Mongol Khans, the histories written by scholars working under Mongol patronage, used euphemisms, marriage alliances when they meant distribution of captive women, integration of populations when they meant forced cultural erasure, adoption of civilized customs when they meant abandonment of original identity under threat of losing your children, natural mixing of peoples when they meant systematic demographic replacement. What survives are fragments. A line in Juvayni's chronicle describing women being counted like sheep. A paragraph in the UN legal code about the classification of captive women and their status in Mongol households. Marco Polo's observations about mixed populations. Ibn Battuta's descriptions of people who looked foreign but acted Mongol. Genetic evidence showing massive population replacement in a single generation. Linguistic studies documenting language death across the empire. Archaeological evidence of cultural discontinuity, cities that were Persian or Chinese before conquest and Mongol after. The women themselves left almost nothing. Not because they didn't exist, not because their suffering wasn't real, not because their numbers were small, but because the system was designed to erase them twice. First, by taking their identity while they lived, by forcing them to become Mongol wives, Mongol mothers, participants in the destruction of their own cultures. Second, by taking their memory after they died, by ensuring their children didn't know their stories, by writing histories that rendered them invisible, by burying them in unmarked graves with no names recorded and no monuments raised. They disappeared into silence. And that silence was the final victory of the system that had conquered them. We don't know exactly what happened to Daria. Her name is invented, a composite of the thousands of women whose names weren't recorded. Her story is reconstructed from the patterns described in multiple sources, from the legal codes, from the chronicles, from the fragmentary evidence that survives. But we know what her life would have looked like. She lived in Batu's household for approximately 23 years. We know this was a typical duration based on surviving household records from similar situations and demographic modeling. She bore 4 children, 2 sons and 2 daughters. This was typical for women in her position. Mongol households valued fertility, and women were expected to bear children regularly. She learned to speak Mongolian fluently. She had no choice. Within 5 years, she probably spoke it better than she spoke Persian, because she spoke Mongolian every day and Persian only in whispers. She taught her children fragments of Persian, whispered words, hidden songs, pieces of a world that no longer existed and that her children would never see. Her children grew up Mongol, thought of themselves as Mongol, served the Mongol Empire in various capacities. Her eldest son, Timur, became a minor military officer. He fought in campaigns in southern China in the early 1250s, part of the Mongol conquest of the Song dynasty. He died there in 1252, age 30, killed in a battle whose name no chronicle bothered to record. He died fighting for the empire that had killed his mother's first husband, conquering people who might have been distant relatives if anyone had tracked such things. Her daughter married a Mongol merchant and moved to Samarkand, had children of her own, grandchildren who were 3/4 Mongol and spoke no Persian at all. Darya lived until approximately 1245. She died speaking 2 languages, thinking in 2 languages, remembering 2 lives, one before and one after. She was buried with Mongol rites because her children knew no other way. They hadn't been taught the prayers she'd grown up with, didn't know the traditions of her homeland, didn't know how someone from her culture was supposed to be sent into the afterlife. So they buried her the Mongol way, because it was the only way they knew. And within a generation, By the time her grandchildren were adults, no one remembered she had ever been anyone other than Batu's wife, the Persian one, not a woman with a name before she met him, not a woman from a city that had been destroyed, not a woman who had lost everything in a single day and then been forced to live for decades inside that loss, participating in the erasure of everything she had been. Just Batu's wife, the Persian one, the one who looked a little different, and then, eventually, as memories faded and the people who had known her died, not even that. Just gone. This is what Conquest actually looked like when you zoom in close enough to see individual lives. Not armies sweeping across maps and history books, not generals making strategic decisions in command tents, not the grand narrative of empire rising and falling, but a woman standing in a courtyard in 1221, watching soldiers point at her, realizing in that single moment that her entire future had just been decided by men who didn't know her name and didn't care. The Mongol Empire lasted from 1206 to 1368 as a unified entity, about 160 years. It lasted longer as fragmented successor states. The Yuan dynasty survived until 1368, the Golden Horde until 1502, the Ilkhanate until 1335, but the echoes lasted longer in the genetic record, those 16 million men alive today carrying Mongol Y chromosome markers, in the languages that disappeared, entire linguistic branches that don't exist anymore, in the cultures that dissolved, religious practices, artistic traditions, social structures that vanished within 2 generations, in the stories that were never written down, the millions of individual lives that were reshaped by this system and then forgotten. What happened to women like Daria wasn't a side effect of Conquest. It was the conquest. The armies just made it possible. They opened the gates. They removed resistance. But the women made it permanent. The women and their children. The slow transformation of populations through forced marriage and cultural replacement and systematic erasure of memory. That's what built the empire. That's what made it last. That's what allowed a relatively small number of Mongol warriors to control the largest continuous land empire in human history. Not just horses and bows, but women, and children, and time. If this story stunned you, if you've never heard history feel this immediate, this visceral, this real, subscribe to Ancient Africa Untold right now. This is what we do here. We take historical events and tell them as if you were standing there, as if you could feel the ground shifting under your feet, as if you were Darya in that courtyard, or the mother in Herat losing her daughter, or the child growing up between 2 names and 2 worlds. Drop a comment right now. What empire should I cover next? What other conquest stories need to be told this way? Because every empire has a version of this story. The Romans did it. The Ottomans did it. The Spanish did it. Different methods, different mechanisms, same fundamental strategy. I'm taking requests, and click the video on your screen. It's another historical nightmare told the same way. Another story that will make you feel like you're living through it. Because this isn't ancient history. This isn't something that happened so long ago it doesn't matter anymore. This is what human beings did to each other 800 years ago. Close enough that we still carry the genetic evidence in our DNA. Close enough that the languages those women spoke are only recently extinct. Close enough that if you go back 25 generations, which is nothing in historical time, you might find a woman like Darya in your own ancestry. Close enough that we should probably pay attention, because the pattern doesn't change. The technology changes. The specific mechanisms change. The names and dates change. But the fundamental strategy, using women's bodies and children's futures as weapons of conquest, that stays the same. And it keeps working until someone decides to remember, to tell the story, to make it real again instead of just abstract numbers in a history book. So remember Daria, remember the mother in Herat, remember the millions whose names we'll never know. Remember that conquest doesn't end on the battlefield. It ends 2 generations later, when the grandchildren have forgotten there was ever anything to fight for.